The morning of July 6, 1918, the sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline above Soissons when the men of the 6th Marine Regiment were told to take the woods, not to probe them, not to reconnoiter, to take them, clear them, and hold them. The order came down through layers of brass and paper and telephone wire until it reached the men who would actually do it, and those men looked at the tree line ahead and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. They had been moving since 4 in the morning. They had been in France since the previous autumn. They had buried friends in Below 6 weeks earlier, and they were being asked to go forward again, into another tree line, on another morning, on another hill that the Germans had decided to defend. Private First Class Matej Kokik was 32 years old that morning. He was not an officer. He was not a sergeant. He was a cook, not in the way the word is sometimes used loosely in military histories, as a man who happened to serve food between engagements. He was a trained cook, a man who had spent the early part of the war feeding his company, scraping field rations into something edible, keeping men alive in the small daily ways that never appear in any citation. He was a Slovak immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1906, who had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1907, and who had spent 11 years becoming exactly the kind of man the Corps produces when it has the time and the raw material to do the work properly. He was compact, quiet, and possessed of the kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from something that has been built on top of it over years of practice. He did not know, on the morning of July 6th, that every officer in his unit would be down before noon. He did not know that he would take the hill himself, that he would do it first with a bayonet, and then with a machine gun he had captured, and that he would hold a position for 3 days with a force of men so reduced in number that they should not have been able to hold it for 3 hours. He did not know any of that. He knew the tree line and the order and that it was time to move. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened on that hillside outside Soissons in July of 1918, you have to understand what the summer 1918 actually was, because it did not feel, from inside it, like the final months of a war that was about to end. It felt like a war that had no end. For years of fighting had produced a landscape without precedent, a strip of churned earth running from the English Channel to the Swiss border, cratered and gassed and strung with wire, presided over by artillery batteries so large and so numerous that the sound of them had become a kind of permanent weather. Somewhere between 8 and 10 million soldiers had already died. The men who remained had learned, largely the hard way, that the war rewarded the specific skill of staying alive through the application of fire and movement, and the willingness to keep moving when every instinct said stop. The Americans had arrived into this situation the previous year, after the United States entered the war in April of 1917. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John Pershing were, for the most part, men who had not yet been ground down by 4 years of static attrition. They brought with them a quality that the French and British forces had largely lost by that point, not necessarily superior training or equipment, but the forward momentum of men who had not yet learned to expect defeat as a default outcome. The Germans had noticed this. The German High Command, following the failure of the spring offensive earlier in 1918, was operating under a kind of institutional desperation. The Ludendorff offensives of March through July had been designed to break the Allied lines before American forces could arrive in sufficient numbers to stabilize them. They had failed. The lines had bent. They had not broken. The Americans were arriving in numbers that grew every month, and the Germans knew, whatever they might say publicly, that the arithmetic of the war had shifted against them. The Aisne-Marne offensive, which began on July 18, 1918, was the Allied counter to Ludendorff's last major push. The broad aim was to reduce the salient the Germans had pushed into the Allied lines around the Marne River, to straighten the front, and to begin the process of pushing the Germans back toward the border. Within this larger offensive, the attack near Soissons on July 6 was part of preliminary operations, the kind of localized assault designed to improve the attacking position before the main effort launched 12 days later. From the perspective of high command, it was a preparatory move. From the perspective of the men on the ground, it was a frontal assault into defended woodland on a hill that offered the Germans every advantage of terrain and preparation. The 6th Marine Regiment was part of the 2nd Division of the United States Army, a combined arms formation that contained both Army and Marine units, and which had established itself at Below with as one of the most tenacious fighting organizations in the AEF. Below would have been a brutal, costly affair. 6 weeks of fighting in a relatively small piece of forest that consumed enormous numbers of men on both sides and demonstrated, expensively, that the Marines could absorb punishment and keep attacking in a way that even the war-hardened French had found remarkable. The Marines came out of below with diminished in numbers, but in large and particular kind of institutional confidence that comes from having survived the worst and discovered you are still functioning. They had barely had time to refit before Soissons was in front of them. Matej Kokik had been born in 1882 in Belai, a town in what was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the region that would eventually become Slovakia after the war. He came from a part of Europe that had been contested ground for centuries, administered by successive empires, inhabited by people who understood, on a bone-deep level, that the territory you stood on had no guarantee of remaining yours. He emigrated to the United States at the age of 24, part of the wave of Central and Eastern European immigrants who came through Ellis Island in the years before the war seeking work and the particular stability of a country not presently on fire. He enlisted in the Marine Corps the following year, in 1907, when he was 25 years old, slightly older than most recruits, and already in possession of the kind of settled temperament that the Corps found useful. He served his first enlistment, re-enlisted, served a second. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, Kokik had been a Marine for a decade. He had served in the Philippines, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in the grinding small unit operations the Corps conducted in the Caribbean basin in the years before the war. These were not glamorous assignments. They were dirty, logistically difficult operations in tropical heat against irregular opponents, and they produced a specific kind of competence, the ability to function without support, to improvise, to keep moving when the plan had broken down, and there was nobody left to issue a new one. The Marine Corps of that era was a small institution, nowhere near the size it had become during the Second World War, and the men who stayed in it through multiple enlistments formed a distinct caste within it, men who had absorbed its specific culture of physical hardness and tactical directness over years of repetition. The Corps in that period operated on the assumption that every man, regardless of his assigned specialty, was first and always a rifleman, and that the other things a man did, cook, clerk, musician, supply handler, existed within that primary identity rather than displacing it. This was not just a doctrinal position. It was practice. Cooks trained with rifles. Clerks ran tactical exercises. The specific logic was that in the small unit operations the Corps specialized in, the distinction between combatant and support personnel could dissolve without warning, and a man who had forgotten which end of his rifle was functional was a liability rather than an asset. Kokik had been absorbing this culture for 11 years. He had also learned, somewhere along the way, to cook, and by the time the regiment reached France, he had been assigned to the company kitchen, which suited his temperament and made use of his patience. A good cook in a frontline unit is not a peripheral figure. He is the man on whom morale rests in the hours between engagements, the one who makes the difference between men who function and men who merely endure. Field rations in 1918 were a study in the bare minimum required to keep a body operating. Standardized packages of canned goods and hard biscuit designed for preservation and portability rather than nutrition or palatability. A cook with ingenuity and access to any supplementary materials could transform the same base ingredients into something that reminded men of an earlier, less terrible life. Kokik had been doing this for months when July arrived, and with it the order to take the woods. The assault on the morning of July 6 moved into difficulty almost immediately. This was not unusual. Assaults in the First World War moved into difficulty almost as a matter of design, because the defensive advantages of the era, machine guns, pre-registered artillery, interlocking fields of fire, barbed wire entanglements, were so substantial that attacking forces had to accept the certainty of early losses in order to close with the enemy at all. The German positions in and around the tree line above Soissons had been prepared carefully. The defenders had the high ground. They had time to dig in, and they had the specific advantage of knowing exactly where any attacking force would have to cross to reach them. The Marines moved forward across open ground toward the tree line. The German machine guns opened up. Men went down. The advance continued, because the only alternative to continuing the advance was dying in the open, which offered fewer options. The officers led from the front, as Marine officers were trained to do, which meant that within the first hour of the assault, the officers were absorbing casualties at a rate that would, by mid-morning, have exhausted the supply of them entirely. A lieutenant went down 50 yards from the jump-off line. A captain was hit while directing fire near the edge of the trees. By mid-morning, the assault had pushed into the tree line, taken the forward edge of the German position, and killed a significant number of the defenders, and it had done this at a cost that had stripped every commissioned officer from a unit. There was now a position to be held by men with no officers, on a hillside with Germans on 3 sides and the men on the 4th side in no condition to send reinforcements. The question of what happens next in this situation is a question the war asked over and over again, and it produced different answers depending entirely on what kind of NCO happened to be present when the officers went down. The answer, on the morning of July 6th outside Soissons, was Matej Kokik. He did not hold a formal command. A cook does not hold a formal command. What he held was the respect of men who had watched him for months operate without complaint in conditions that would have broken most people, and who understood, when they looked at him in the immediate aftermath of the last officer going down, that he knew what to do. This is not a small thing. In the confusion of a contested position, with fire coming from multiple directions and the situation changing from minute to minute, the ability to project calm certainty is itself a form of weapon. Kokik projected it. He had been in enough difficult situations in a decade of small unit operations to understand that the moment after catastrophe is also the moment when clear action has the greatest effect, before secondary panic can set in, before men start making individual calculations about survival that, taken together, produce collapse. He organized the survivors. He assessed the position. He looked at the German line and made the same calculation Solomon would make on a different island on a different ocean a generation later. The men behind him needed time, and he was the one who had to buy it. The position the Marines had taken in the tree line was not, by itself, defensible for long. The Germans knew the ground. They could see the flanks. There was a machine gun emplacement to the left, dug into a rise in the tree line, that had a field of fire covering the entire route the Marines needed to use to consolidate and bring up support. It had to go. Kokik went for it himself. What he did next is documented in his Medal of Honor citation with the compressed precision that citations use for actions that will require pages to fully describe. He advanced against a machine gun emplacement through fire, reached it, and instead of flanking it with grenades or a rifle fire, which would have been the standard approach, he went in with his bayonet. He killed the crew. He took the gun. He then turned the captured weapon and used it to suppress a second German position that had been preventing the Marines from consolidating the ground they had taken. The physical fact of this needs to sit for a moment. A machine gun emplacement of the First World War era was not a lightly held position. The German MG-08, the standard heavy machine gun of the German Army in 1918, was a water-cooled belt-fed weapon weighing over 60 pounds in its sustained fire configuration, crewed by multiple men, dug into a prepared position with overhead cover and fields of fire cleared in advance. The crew were trained specialists, men whose entire military education had been focused on the operation of that specific weapon in exactly this kind of defensive situation. Kokik reached this position under fire with a bayonet. The citation says he killed the crew. The citation does not elaborate, because there is nothing to elaborate. He killed them. He then operated the captured gun. This requires particular note, because it is not a small technical matter. The German MG-08 fired the German standard 7.92mm cartridge from a fabric belt, used a toggle lock recoil mechanism, and required specific training to operate reliably under field conditions. The weapon was well designed and robust, but it was not intuitive to a man who had trained on American equipment. Kokik had enough weapons knowledge, accumulated across 11 years of Marine service and multiple combat deployments, to work the mechanism and put fire on the second German position. He did this. The second position fell. The Marines consolidated their ground. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What followed over the next 3 days was not a single dramatic action, but a sustained test of the most demanding kind, the kind the Ben Solomon action on Saipan illustrates from a different angle. The test of whether a man can keep functioning, keep deciding, keep organizing others when the situation offers him no reason to believe that any of it is going to be sufficient. This is a distinction that military historians sometimes lose in the effort to make events legible. Single moments of extraordinary courage are easier to narrate than sustained competence under prolonged stress. The moment Kokik went for the machine gun emplacement with a bayonet is the moment that fits into a sentence, into a citation, into the compressed vocabulary of official recognition. The 3 days that followed are harder to render because they consist not of one dramatic decision, but of hundreds of small ones, the constant maintenance of discipline and position and morale in a unit that had every material reason to collapse. To hold a position under repeated counterattack with depleted forces is not a single act. It is a continuous series of decisions about where to place men, when to shift a machine gun to cover a new threat axis, how to manage ammunition consumption against an unknown timeline for relief, how to communicate urgency without communicating despair, how to keep men who are exhausted and frightened and cut off from support believing that what they are doing is necessary and possible. These decisions do not appear in citations because citations are not built to contain them. They appear only in the results, in the fact that the position was still held when the relief finally arrived, in the fact that the men who survived those 3 days were able to walk out under their own power rather than being found by a search party days later. The position on the hillside outside Soissons was isolated. The assault had pushed forward faster than the flanking units could keep pace, which was a common consequence of the way the Marines attacked in this period. With a momentum that outran coordination, the Germans knew the ground. They counterattacked. Not once, repeatedly. The first counterattack came the afternoon of July 6th, pushed in from the northeast along a draw in a tree line that gave them partial cover from the Marines' field of fire. Kokik organized the defense. He positioned the men he had, directed fire, and held the position. The counterattack withdrew. The second came that night. Night attacks in the wooded terrain around Soissons in July of 1918 were exercises in pure sound and controlled panic, with visibility measured in feet, enemy movement identifiable only by sound and muzzle flash, and a constant danger of firing into your own men who were moving in the dark for the same reasons you were. Kokik held the position through the night. The defenders were short on everything, ammunition, water, food, sleep, but they were in possession of the ground, and Kokik gave them no reason to believe they would not remain so. The ammunition situation deserves specific attention because it is the factor that turns abstract courage into concrete calculation. A machine gun position without ammunition is not a defensive asset. It is a fixed point that attracts fire without being able to return it, which is, in tactical terms, worse than no position at all. The Marines on the hillside had what they had carried forward, supplemented by whatever had been taken from German dead, and they were expending at the rate that sustained contact demands. Every counterattack consumed more than it could be replaced. Kokik managed this by the specific means available to him: rationing fire, identifying which sectors require the most attention, directing the machine gun to cover the most threatened approaches while accepting greater risk on the flanks. These decisions were made without the benefit of resupply, without communications to higher command, without any confirmed knowledge of when or whether relief would arrive. They were made on the basis of what could be seen and heard and inferred by a man who had spent 11 years learning how to make exactly these kinds of decisions in exactly this kind of information vacuum. By the morning of July 7th, the unit had been in contact for over 24 hours. They were reduced in numbers. They were low on ammunition. They were on a piece of ground that the Germans wanted back and were willing to pay for. The situation was, by any objective assessment, desperate. Kokik did not communicate this to men, not because he was deceiving them, but because the communication of despair in that situation serves no military purpose and every human one in the wrong direction. He communicated what was necessary, the positions they needed to hold, the sectors each man was responsible for, the specific actions required when the next attack came. It came. He held. The resupply and relief that finally reached the position on July 8th did not find men in a condition of defeat. They found men who had been in sustained contact with the enemy for 3 days, who were exhausted and under-equipped and should, by any calculation of forces, have been overrun, and who had not been overrun because a 32-year-old Slovak-American cook had decided on the morning of the first day that the position would hold. This is the psychological core of what Kokik did, the same core that makes the Ben Solomon story and the Tommy McPherson story resonant across the decades. He operated from a decision rather than a calculation. Calculation, in all three cases, pointed toward withdrawal or defeat. Solomon on Saipan was one man with a machine gun against thousands. McPherson, on the banks of the Loire, had a handful of men and a bluff against 23,000 German soldiers. Kokik had a captured German machine gun, no officers, depleted ammunition, and a hillside in France. In all three cases, the man at the center made a decision that the calculation did not support, and then held to that decision through everything the situation could produce to refute it. The difference between a decision and a calculation is not courage in the abstract. It is a specific practice of holding to a course of action when the evidence around you is actively arguing for a different one. This is what separates men who function in the worst moment of combat from men who do not. Not the absence of fear, not superior physical capability, but the deeply grooved habit of continuing to act purposefully when purpose seems hardest to locate. Matej Kokik had been building that habit since 1907. The formal recognition of what Kokik had done came in two waves, which itself tells you something about the nature of institutional recognition in wartime. The way heroism in the field travels up the chain of command through layers of paperwork and competing priorities before it arrives at a desk where someone has the authority and the attention to do something about it. The first recognition was the Médaille Militaire, awarded by the French government. The French had been watching the Americans at Soissons with the particular attention of an ally who has been fighting the same enemy for 4 years and has developed a precise eye for what combat effectiveness looks like and what its absence looks like. The Marines had impressed them expensively and repeatedly since WWII, and the French awards that came to American units during the summer of 1918 were not ceremonial courtesies, but professional assessments by men who knew what they were looking at. The Médaille Militaire was presented to Kokik with the Croix de Guerre with palm, the palm denoting a citation at the Army level, the highest degree of the decoration. The citation noted his capture of the machine gun, his repulsion of the counterattacks, and his maintenance of the position under sustained enemy pressure. The American recognition was slower, which was, as the Ben Solomon story makes clear in its own much more extended way, a characteristic of military bureaucracy in all eras. Kokik's Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. He was wounded in the fighting near Soissons. The exact date and circumstances of his death are recorded in the regimental records as October 4th, 1918, near Blancmont Ridge. In the final weeks of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the great Allied push that ended the war, he had survived WWII, survived Soissons, survived the summer of 1918, and died 7 weeks before the armistice. He was 36 years old. The Medal of Honor was presented to his family on September 18, 1919, nearly a year after his death, at a ceremony that received modest attention compared with the enormous demobilization parades and homecoming celebrations of that period. He was one of 8 Marines to receive the Medal of Honor for actions at Soissons. He is one of the very few Medal of Honor recipients of the First World War who had spent any significant portion of his military career in a kitchen. The citation reads, in the precise formal language that citations use to compress extraordinary events into sentences that could be read in under a minute. In the face of heavy machine gun fire, Kokik fearlessly advanced alone on the enemy's machine gun nest and, after killing or wounding all of the crew with his bayonet, turned the gun on the retreating enemy. He then organized the men remaining in his vicinity into a fighting force and led them in holding the hard-won position for 3 days under repeated enemy counterattacks. It is a sentence that contains 3 days and a captured machine gun and a hillside outside Soissons and the bodies of German soldiers killed at bayonet range, and it conveys all of this in the neutral, declarative tone that military citations favor, as if what is being described as a series of routine administrative decisions rather than the extreme edge of what a human being can be asked to do and do. The broader military context of July 1918 matters here, because it shapes what Kokik's action meant beyond the immediate tactical result. The Aisne-Marne offensive, which launched on July 18th, 12 days after Kokik took his position on the hillside, was the beginning of what military historians call a 100 Days Offensive, the sustained Allied push that ended the war on November 11th. The preliminary operations of early July, including the assault at Soissons, were part of the process of creating conditions for that larger push, of establishing positions from which the main effort could launch, of wearing down German reserves and disrupting their defensive preparations. From inside those preliminary operations, none of this was visible. The men at Soissons on July 6 knew the immediate order and the immediate ground. They did not know that what they were doing was part of the end of the war. They could not have known, because the end of the war was not yet a known quantity. It would become known only in retrospect, only when the armistice came in November, and men could look back and trace the sequence of events that had led there. But that retrospective coherence was not available to Kokik on the morning of July 6th. He had a tree line and an order and the knowledge, from 11 years of accumulated experience, of what a man in his position could do. He did it. The particular weight of Kokik's story, the detail that gives it its specific texture among the many stories of extraordinary action that the First World War produced, is the Cook detail. Not because it is ironic, in the way that a dentist winning a Medal of Honor in the Pacific is ironic, the incongruity between the state of profession and the nature of the action. It is more than ironic. It is illustrative of something that military training produces over time that resists easy categorization, a kind of transferable competence, a set of habits and dispositions that are built in the specific context of military service, but that do not, when the situation demands it, stay confined to the role they were built for. Kokik was a cook because the regiment needed cooks. He was also a man who had been a Marine for 11 years, who had operated in Haiti and the Dominican Republic and the Philippines, who had carried a rifle and learned to use it and learned the doctrines and the small unit tactics and the specific physical vocabulary of organized violence that the Marine Corps transmitted to the men who stayed long enough to absorb it fully. His assignment to the kitchen did not remove any of that. It only meant that on most days, he expressed it by keeping men fed rather than keeping them alive by some other means. On July 6th, the situation required the other means. He had them. There is a specific quality that connects Kokik's 3 days on the hillside to the broader pattern of extraordinary action in the Second World War, and in every war, which is a quality of continuing beyond the rational stopping point. Solomon on Saipan kept firing machine gun with 76 wounds in his body. McPherson faced a German general with 23,000 men and offered terms as if he had the forces to enforce them. Kokik held a position for 3 days with no officers, depleted ammunition, and an enemy that kept coming. In each case, the man at the center continued past the point where the situation, honestly assessed, offered grounds for continuation. The thing that is easy to miss, looking at these stories from the distance of decades, is that the continuing was not irrational. It was not the product of a man unable to read the situation correctly. It was a product of a man who had read the situation correctly and had made a specific judgment about what the situation required, independent of what it offered. The difference is crucial. Irrational continuation is what produces futile last stands, men dying for nothing in positions that could not be held and should not have been attempted. Rational continuation, the kind Kokik practiced, is what produces positions held against all probability because the man holding them has correctly identified what will happen to men behind him if he stops. The 30 wounded soldiers in Solomon's aid station, the resistance fighters on the bridge over the Loire, the Marines on a hillside that needed 3 more days. These are the men who did not die for nothing. They died when they died, because they had chosen to put themselves between the worst of the situation and the men who needed to survive it. That choice is not reducible to courage as an abstraction. It is a specific practice, repeatedly renewed decision to value the lives of others above the calculation of personal survival. It is what the Medal of Honor is supposed to recognize, and it is what it recognizes when the bureaucracy and the paperwork and the time delays of institutional recognition eventually deliver it to the right place. Kokik's medal went to his family in September of 1919. Solomon's medal went to a display case at the University of Southern California in May of 2002. McPherson's medals accumulated over a lifetime of subsequent service. The timing of recognition tells you something about institutions, about their speed and their reliability, and the friction between what men do in the field and what gets formally acknowledged afterward. It tells you less about the actions themselves. The actions existed independent of their recognition. The 3 days on the hillside outside Soissons happened whether or not the medal followed. The 76 wounds and the 98 Japanese soldiers happened in July of 1944, regardless of what a president said about them 58 years later. The recognition matters because the stories matter, because the transmission of what these men did is itself a kind of duty, the obligation of those who come after to maintain the record of what was possible, what human beings have been willing to do for each other under the worst conditions a war can produce. There is another thing that the recognition does, less discussed and perhaps more important. It pushes back against the natural tendency of institutions to remember their own categories. The military, like all large organizations, organizes its memory around rank and role. Generals are remembered for campaigns, colonels for battles. The men in between are remembered, if at all, for the single action that distinguished them from the mass. What tends to get lost is the texture of the men themselves, the accumulated years and small competencies and specific experiences that made the single action possible. Kokik is remembered, where he is remembered at all, for July 6, 1918. He is less often remembered for the 11 years before it, the years in the Philippines and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the years of enlistment and re-enlistment, the years of cooking and drilling, and absorbing the specific culture of an institution that was building in him, without either party fully knowing it, exactly the capacities he would need on a hillside in France. The same is true of Solomon. He is remembered for the machine gun and the 76 wounds. He is less often remembered for the decade of physical training and tactical study and competitive athleticism that preceded Saipan, the years of becoming the best all-around soldier in his regiment while the army insisted he was a dentist. The man who held a machine gun position for over an hour with multiple wounds was the product of those years. The machine gun position was where those years became visible, but they had been accumulating long before. This is what military service, at its best, produces in the men who stay long enough to receive it fully. People who are more than their current assignment, who have been built through time and repetition and deliberate hardship into something that exceeds the category they are filed under. The category Kokik was filed under was cook. The thing he actually was turned out to be considerably more than that. The war, in its brutality and his indifference to organizational charts, revealed this in the morning. Matej Kokik is buried in the Musargon American Cemetery in Romain-sur-Montfaucon, France, in a row of white crosses that extends further than the eye easily follows. The cemetery contains 14,246 American servicemen from the First World War, the largest American military cemetery in Europe. His grave is marked. His name is on the stone. It does not say cook. It says sergeant, which was the rank he held when he was killed in October 1918. The rank the Corps had promoted him to after Soissons, after the hillside, after the 3 days. He made sergeant at 36, 11 years into his career, which tells you something about the pace of advancement for enlisted men in the pre-war Corps, where ranks were few and competition was sustained, and the men who held stripes held them because there was no faster path to them than the one that required time and demonstrated competence. He was promoted when the Corps had fresh evidence of what his competence consisted of, evidence gathered on a hillside in France with a captured German machine gun, and no officers, and a line of men who needed to know that someone was going to tell them what to do next. He told them, the 6th Marine Regiment still exists. It is part of the 2nd Marine Division, the same division that fought at Soissons and Belleauwood, the same division that would fight a generation later at Tarawa and Saipan and Tinian and Iwo Jima. The regiment carries its battle honors from 1918 forward, through everything that came after, a continuous institutional memory of what the men who serve in it were capable of doing. Kokik's action is part of that memory, part of the specific texture of what the regiment knows about itself. The hill outside Soissons is farmland now. The forest that the Marines fought through in July of 1918 has been cleared and replanted and cleared again in the century since. The ground is healed in the slow way that ground heals when the men and the wire and the craters are finally removed and the seasons are allowed to do their work without interruption. There is no marker where the machine gun emplacement was. There is no sign indicating the position that held for 3 days. There is a cemetery in Romain where the white crosses stand in their patient rows, and there is a citation in the official records of the United States Marine Corps that begins, without drama or embellishment, with the words, "In the face of heavy machine gun fire." That is where Matej Kokik's story lives, in a line of a citation, in a grave in France, in the regimental history of a unit that has been fighting for a century. in the specific, accumulated tradition of what it means to continue past a rational stopping point, to look at the situation as it actually is, and make the decision that the situation does not, by itself, support, but that the men behind you absolutely require. He was a cook. He was a Marine for 11 years. He was, for 3 days in July of 1918, the only thing standing between a piece of ground and the enemy that wanted it back. He held that ground until the relief came. That is what the Medal of Honor recognizes. Not the rank, not the job title, not the years of service or the campaigns before. The decision, made in the worst moment, to stay. Matej Kokic stayed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.